Chapter 5, Rate PID Tuning. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at tuning the rate controller. This controller controls how fast the drone rotates around the three axes, roll, pitch and yaw, and it's the lowest level PID controller in Arducopter. This means that getting this tune right is very important as a foundation for the higher level tuning that we're going to be doing later in the course. And it is also when we're going to be first starting to use the approaches for PID tuning that we will be using on all the PID controllers throughout the entire course. So this is really where we're going to build the foundational knowledge that will carry us through tuning all of the other PID controllers in ArduPilot. We're going to be looking at the different terms, the P, the I, the D term. We're going to be looking at feed forward and derivative feed forward, and a scientific method of tuning all of those so that you get an optimal PID response and you get the drone following the target rates of rotation as closely as possible. Again, this is a lot to cover. It's a longer chapter, so take your time with it. Make sure that you really embed this knowledge because we're going to need it later on for tuning all of the other controllers. That said, let's not waste any more time. Let's dive into it. Before we dive into the theory of PID tuning ArduPilot, I just want to give you some background on all of the different PID controllers that ArduPilot has inside it. ArduPilot uses a cascade of PID controllers to control the position, the velocity, the acceleration, the angle, and the rate of rotation of the drone. And to get good autonomous flight performance, you need every single one of these PID controllers to be correctly tuned. And so we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. And that's the way that we have to tune these things, because you can't tune these high level controllers if the lower level controllers are not performing brilliantly. Before we dive into the methodical tuning approach for the rate PID controller, which is the first one we're going to look at, it's important to have a theoretical understanding of PID control, an understanding of what all the different terms are within the PID controller and what they do, so that we know how to adjust them to achieve the desired outcome, the desired effect. This diagram shows you a schematic of the rate PID controller in ArduPilot. On the left, we have the two inputs. The first is the target rate of rotation. This is how fast the quad is being asked to rotate around each axis. And that target rate of rotation can come from the pilot stick inputs in acro mode, or more likely from the angle controller when you're flying in any of the other modes. The second input is the actual rate of rotation, and that comes from the gyro in the IMU on your flight controller. This tells the quad how fast it's actually rotating around each of the axes. So we have the target and the actual rate of rotation. These are fed into a number of different terms. We have the feed forward term, the derivative feed forward term, which looks at the time derivative of the target rate of rotation. And then we also have a PID error term, which is calculated by subtracting the actual rate from the target rate to get an error. And that is then fed into two terms, a proportional term and an integral term. The integral term looks at the time integral of PID error. And then we also have a derivative term, which is just the time derivative of the actual rate of rotation. All of these terms are multiplied by different gains, which we're going to set in the ArduPilot software, and then they are all added together to give a commanded control output, which is going to be fed into the motor mixer, which will drive the motors, and that will command the quad to do the correct rotation. If all of these terms are correctly balanced, then the quad will follow the target rate of rotation very, very closely. If any of these terms are incorrect, they've got the value that's too high or too low, then the actual rotor rotation won't follow the target rate of rotation very well, and the drone won't fly well. So the whole purpose of the methodical PID tune is to get the actual rate of rotation to match the target rate of rotation as closely as possible by tuning the gains of all of these different terms. Now that we've seen each of these terms in the schematic, let's dive into how each of them behave, starting with the proportional term. The proportional term acts on PID error, so the PID error is the difference between the target and actual rate of rotation, and it simply is a multiple of the PID error. So the larger the PID error gets, the harder the proportional term pushes back towards the target. So if the PID error is positive, then the proportional term will push to reduce that error and try and bring it down to 0. The P term acts like the spring in a suspension strut. The further away the actual rate of rotation is from the target rate of rotation, the bigger the P term gets, and it's always pushing to try and reduce that PID error. The next term we're going to talk about is the derivative term. And the derivative term wants the actual value of the rate of rotation to stay the same all the time. So the derivative term, the D term, pushes back against any change in the actual rate of rotation. So if the actual rate of rotation is increasing, the D term pushes to try and slow the rate of that increase. If the actual rate of rotation changes a lot, then the D term becomes very large and it pushes back against that change. The derivative term acts like the shock absorber in a suspension strut. It's always looking to slow down how quickly the quad responds or the drone responds to any input and to keep that actual rate of rotation as low as possible. Obviously, getting the right balance of D term is very important because if you have too much D term, the drone will be slow to respond. If you have too little, it will respond too quickly and oscillate. Just like in the suspension strut for a car or bike, the balance between the spring, the P term, and the shock absorber, the D term, is very, very important. If you have too much P term, then everything's going to be too bouncy and too liable to oscillate. If you have too much D term, everything is going to be very slow to respond. With the correct balance of P term to D term, you get what's called a critically damped response that gives you a very smooth response to changes in input, just like a really nicely balanced suspension strut. The ArduPilot default PD balance is usually a suitable starting point, but can often be a bit heavy on the P term and so prone to oscillate. You're going to have to see how it stacks up for your particular drone, and we're going to be looking at how you tune that PD balance later in this guide. The right balance between the P and D terms is the first step of a really good PID tune for a PID controller. So getting that right is going to be the first thing that you're going to want to look at. Similar to the proportional term, the integral term looks at the PID error. But unlike the proportional term, the integral term adds up the PID error over time and pushes back harder and harder the longer the error persists. We can see in this diagram that we have a small constant positive PID error, and the integral term is pushing back harder and harder and harder as that PID error builds up over time. When the PID error goes negative, the integral term doesn't stop pushing right away, but instead it starts accumulating in the opposite direction, which means that the integral term starts reducing down again. Obviously, if this negative PID error was to continue for a long period of time, we would expect to see the integral term build up in the opposite direction and again pushing back to try and reduce that PID error to 0. The feed-forward term in ArduPilot is another proportional term, but rather than looking at the PID error, the feed-forward term looks at the target. The larger the value of the target, the harder the feed-forward term pushes in the same direction as the target. This feed-forward term helps to overcome resistance that increases in proportion to the target value. There aren't that many situations where that's an important and useful capability to have, but one of them is in the vertical velocity controller. If you're trying to move upwards with a high vertical velocity, then gravity provides a resistance that increases in proportion to the vertical velocity that you're looking to achieve. So in this case, the feed-forward term helps overcome that resistance, and it reduces the amount of work that the P term has to do. So you're not always going to need feed-forward, but there are certain PID controllers where it can be very, very useful. The derivative feed-forward term in the ArduPilot PID controller looks at the rate at which the target is changing, and it pushes in the direction that the target is changing in proportion to how fast the target is changing. The main purpose of the derivative feed-forward term is to allow the PID controller to react more quickly before PID error builds up, and if you have derivative feed-forward correctly set, it can reduce or even eliminate the delay between changes in target and actual values, and that really helps the controller respond much more quickly to sudden changes in the target. Now that you've seen the theory behind all of the terms in the ArduPilot PID controller, it's time to give you an overview of the PID tuning methodology. We are going to be taking the tune in a certain order. We're going to start with the derivative term, move on to the proportional term, then do the integral term, before finishing off with the derivative feed-forward term and finally the feed-forward term. The reason we're doing the tune in this order is that there are particular relationships between these terms that need to be respected. The D term prevents the P term oscillating, so there is a correct ratio between the P and D terms. Similarly, the P term prevents the I term oscillating, so there is a correct relationship between the P and I terms. The derivative feed-forward term depends on the value of particularly the P term, and the correct feed-forward value is going to depend on how tightly the rest of the controller is tuned. By tuning in the order D, P, I, DFF, FF, we won't need to go back and adjust earlier terms based on what we do later in the tuning process. So we have a one-way flow through the tuning methodology. We start with the D term and move through sequentially all the way through to the feed-forward term. And once we've done that, the tune is finished. If you do the tune in any other order apart from this, then you may find that you change the P term and then you have to go back and adjust the D term later on, and you can get in a real muddle because there isn't a clear flow and things are dependent on each other. So that's why we're going to be taking this approach going through the tuning process. In order to get the best possible PID tune, it's important to know how to do PID tuning flights. Now, PID tuning flights consist of sharp wobbles on all three axes, and you're going to do the sharp moves by rapidly moving the stick back and forth and then bringing it quickly back to center. When you do these sharp moves, make sure you keep hold of the stick as it comes back to center. If you just release the sticks and let them kind of bounce back to center under their own spring action, they can oscillate and bounce around the center, and that can make the drone oscillate, which might make you think you have too much P gain when you actually don't. You can do these sharp moves in stabilized mode. I would suggest that that's the best, or you could do it in altitude hold. But if you're doing it in altitude hold mode, that does rely on the altitude controller being reasonably well tuned to begin with, which it may not be. If you're getting any oscillations, try switching to stabilized mode, because that will take the altitude controller out of the equation and will allow you just to be looking at the rate and angle PID controllers. So for a typical PID tuning flight, you're just going to want to take off and hover in stabilized mode. And then give the drone small oscillations, first on the roll axis, then on the pitch axis, and then finally on the yaw axis. And just do that for maybe 10 to 20 seconds on each axis. And then bring the drone into land. That's all you need to do for a PID tuning flight. Once you've finished your test flight, it's time to land and then download the log using Mission Planner the way we did before, and open the log file in ArduPilot Web Tools PID Review. So you can do that by just going and clicking the Choose File button, selecting the log file that you downloaded with Mission Planner, and then loading it in. Check that the flight data graph, which should appear immediately after you've loaded in the log, looks correct, that it kind of reflects what you did during the flight, that there are no gaps or logging dropouts, and that everything is working correctly. Once you've done that, select the PID roll, PID pitch, or PID yaw graph to look at, and I would move through them in order. So start with roll, then move to pitch, and finally yaw. When you scroll down to the time domain, you'll see a graph that looks something like this. And you can see that it's pretty much completely unreadable at the default zoom level. you're going to want to zoom in on a part of the flight where you were wobbling the drone on the target axis, the axis that you're looking at right now. So let's say we're starting with the roll axis. You're going to zoom into a part of the flight where you were doing those sharp wobbles on the roll axis. Once you've zoomed in to the right amount, you should see a chart that looks something like this. You should be able to see the target in blue, the actual in orange, and the error in green. The goal is to get the actual to sit directly on top of the target, and that's what we're going to be trying to do as we go through our PID tuning process. It is possible to tune PD balance, and in fact to tune all the PIDs using only time series data. And it's actually useful to learn how to do this because for some controllers, like the throttle controller, we will only ever have access to time series data. We're not going to be able to get step responses or anything like that because the tooling doesn't really exist for it. So if you can learn to tune using just time series data, that's great, although we will also be using the step response as well. When we're tuning PD balance based on time series data, what we're going to be looking at is the relationship between the actual value and the target value. We will find that without any derivative feed forward, the actual value is always going to lag behind the target value a little bit. And that's okay, that's normal, that's what we want. What we need to look at is the relationship between the actual peak value and the target peak value in the time series data to determine if we've got the right PD balance. If you look at the waveform for the target and the waveform for the actual, and you see that the peak of the actual graph is bigger than the target graph, that indicates that you have too much p-term. So your PD balance is too p-term heavy. So you need to reduce your p-term or increase your d-term. If you have a target graph that is larger, the peak is higher than in the actual graph, like this one down here, then that means that your PD balance is too D-term heavy. Your D-term is too large, and so that's meaning that your actual movement of the quad doesn't ever reach the same peak level as the target is requesting. If you have the ideal PD balance, what you'll see is that the target peak and the actual peak will be of exactly the same amplitude. If you're seeing this, so the actual is delayed a little bit from the target, but the peak value is the same, then that means that your PD balance is exactly correct, and that means that you can move on to the next stage of tuning that axis. It's also possible to tune the PD balance using the step response. And if you scroll down in ArduPilot PID Review, you'll find the step response graph. You'll see lots of faint gray lines and then one blue line, which is the average of all the gray lines. What we're looking for is to have the blue line rise as quickly as possible to the 1.0 level and then just continue straight flat from there. If we look at this chart down here, you can see that if we have a graph like this green line where we shoot way past 100% or 1.0 and then bounce up and down for a long time, that indicates that we have too much p-term. If we look at a line like this purplish line here that kind of takes a long time to gradually reach up to 1.0, that indicates that we've got too much d-term. And so we need to either increase p-term or reduce d-term. If you have something that looks like the red line, which is a rapid rise to 1.0 without any overshoot, then that indicates that your PD balance is correct and you have the right ratio of p-term to d-term. So you can use a step response. This is giving you exactly the same information as the time series data that we were looking at previously, just in a different form. Some people find it easier, but for different controllers on ArduPilot, you will eventually have to do some PID tuning using only the time series data, so it's good to practice that if you can. It's important to know when tuning the PD balance that it is the ratio between the p-term and d-term that is important, not the individual values. I would suggest only changing the p-term while you're tuning the PD balance, because that will keep things very simple. And if you change the p-term, of course, you're changing the ratio between the p and the d terms. You can do this in Mission Planner config extended tuning, and you can just kind of move the p-term up and down. Unless you have a completely symmetric drone, the pitch and roll values are likely to be a bit different. So you can probably unlock the pitch and roll values and then tune them individually. Especially the more asymmetric your drone is on pitch and roll, the more different the ideal PD balance for pitch and roll is likely to be. If during this process you find you are suffering from oscillations, so the quad is kind of oscillating on one of the axes, and you reduce the P term and the oscillations don't improve, then this could be two things. You might be experiencing D term oscillation. If your D gains are too high, then the D term can self-oscillate independent of the P term, and in that case, reducing the P term doesn't help. To fix this, reduce both the D and P terms in steps of 10%. So divide the D and P term by 1.1 and see if the oscillations improve. And if they do, keep dividing the D term and P term together by 1.1, because you're keeping that ratio the same, but you're reducing the values until the oscillations go away. Excessive filter delay can also cause oscillations. Now, hopefully if you've followed through my gyro filter tuning video, you should not have excessive filter delay. But if you haven't looked at the gyro filters yet, you may want to go back and watch that video and make sure that you've got your gyro filtering as clean as it possibly can be, and you've got the delay of the gyro filters as low as you can possibly get to avoid oscillations due to excessive filter delay. But that's another thing to check. Tuning the PID filters is a more advanced topic in ArduPilot. ArduPilot provides the option to apply low-pass filtering within the PID loop, and there are 3 low-pass filters which can each be tuned individually for all 3 axes. You have FLTE, which is the error filter. When you subtract the actual rate of rotation from the target rate of rotation, that gives the error, and ArduPilot provides an option to apply a low-pass filter to that. FLTD is the derivative low-pass filter. When you take the derivative of the actual value, you amplify high frequency noise. And so a low pass filter is always required on a derivative term to reduce the amount of high frequency noise that is kind of being amplified naturally by the derivative term. FLTT is the target low pass filter. This is sometimes required, sometimes not required. It's simply a filter to ensure that the target does not oscillate or move, change value, faster than the drone is able to respond. Each axis is going to be tuned separately unless you have a perfectly symmetric drone, in which case you may find you get the same values on pitch and roll. The yaw axis is always going to behave somewhat differently to pitch and roll. Let's start by looking at target filtering, because I think this is the one that you're probably going to potentially use more of the time. Error filtering is not usually required on the pitch and roll axes. Error filtering is typically used to reduce oscillations of the P term. On the pitch and roll axis, we have a derivative term that damps the oscillation. So that means we don't need error filtering. Target filtering may or may not be required. It depends how responsive your drone is and how fast the target ends up moving. If your target value is oscillating or moving much, much faster than your drone is able to respond because you have a big, heavy drone that is slow to respond, then using target filtering to slow down how fast the target can move can be really helpful, just to allow the drone to keep up with the target and avoid getting into the situation where the drone is effectively oscillating, trying to keep up with a target that it's not able to. INS gyro filter over 2 is a reasonable starting point for a target filter, but this cutoff can usually be increased and should be increased if possible to reduce delay. And if you're not in the situation where your target is moving faster than your drone is able to respond, then you should eliminate the target filter and set it to 0. Error filtering is not needed on pitch and roll because we have a D term. On the yaw axis, we don't typically have a D term, and that means you can get into a situation where you get oscillation of the P term. And here, error filtering can be used to prevent this oscillation occurring. Error filtering on the yaw axis with a low cutoff helps avoid the error term oscillating when there's no D term, and it also helps avoid sudden yaw requests leading to huge motor differentials, particularly on drones with low yaw authority, which can also be bad and put the drivetrain under a lot of stress. If your drone has really good yaw authority and you want a snappy yaw response, you can try increasing particularly the error filter, because the default is a very low cutoff, and that will allow the drone to yaw more sharply. Again, as with the other axes, you have a target filter on yaw as well. So you should be setting the target filter so that your target is not moving faster than the drone is able to respond on the yaw axis. And then you should be setting the error filter to ensure that the motor throttle doesn't ramp up so quickly on sharp yaw inputs that it puts too much stress on the motors and ESCs. Both the pitch and yaw axes are also going to require derivative filtering. This is essential because the D term naturally amplifies high frequency noise. And so if you don't have any additional low pass filtering on the D term, you will very quickly find that the high frequency noise dominates, because any high frequency noise is going to be amplified a lot by the D term, and the higher the frequency, the larger the amplification factor. Yaw doesn't typically have a D term and so doesn't require any derivative filtering. However, if you decide for whatever reason that you do want a derivative term on the yaw axis, this can sometimes be the case for V tails or A tails with a lot of yaw authority. Adding that D term will then require you to add D term filtering in order to avoid the high frequency noise just dominating the D term on the yaw axis. INS gyro filter over 2 is a reasonable starting point for any derivative filtering. And the cutoff value of the D-term filter should be increased as far as possible without D-term noise being large compared to the signal. And the way you're going to judge this is by looking at a log, looking at the time series data of a log, and looking at the high frequency noise on the D-term compared to the size of the D-term signal itself. So here we have the D term in green, and you can see that we have a low frequency movement of the D term, which is corresponding to the damping that it's doing for the axis. And then we also have these kind of little high frequency wiggles. You don't want those high frequency wiggles to be more than about 10% of the overall signal. If it gets much more than 10% of the overall signal, then it starts to really inject a lot of noise energy, noise power into the signal that's going to the motors, and that can cause the motors to heat up and make your drone less efficient. So you can increase the D term low pass filtering, FLTD, a little bit, as long as the high frequency noise component is still staying less than about 10% of the low frequency signal component. Once you've found the overall correct PD balance for the pitch and roll axes, we're going to want to try and increase the overall PID gains to improve the responsiveness of the quad and reduce PID error. We want to do this without changing the ratio between the P and D terms that we've already found. And so the way that I would suggest you do this is to increase P, I, and D by the same multiple. So to find the new P term, multiply the old P term by 1.1. That's an increase of 10%. For the I term, again, it's the old I term times 1.1, and the new D term will be the old D term times 1.1. Because we're multiplying all of the values by the same multiple, the ratio between P term and D term and the ratio between P term and I term won't change. And that means that the step response of the quad also shouldn't change. We're just increasing those PID gains, tightening up the PID controller and reducing PID error whilst keeping that critical PD ratio exactly the same. Keep increasing P, I, and D using this rule by just multiplying by 10%. Until you start to see oscillations coming in the logs, and the quad will kind of feel very, very tight, and you will start to hear little sort of trilling oscillations, particularly after sharp moves. Once you start to hear or start to see oscillations in the logs, back the P, I, and D gains down by 10 or 20%. What you're looking to find is the maximum value for the P, I, and D gains where you don't see any hint of oscillation at all, and that's the ideal value. You're going to need to adjust the roll and pitch axes separately, because unless your quad is perfectly symmetric, you will have a different maximum P, I, and D gain for the pitch and roll axes. In many cases, increasing the overall PID gains with the correct PD balance is going to give you a pretty drastic improvement in flight performance. And hopefully this should tell you that you're on the right track with your tuning. Now that you've found the overall maximum P, I and D gains for your quad, it's time to look at the I term. Now the I term typically has a very wide tuning window, so it is not always necessary to directly tune the I term once you've found the absolute PID gains, the magnitude of them that works really well. However, theoretically increasing the I term can give target tracking improvements because it means that I term responds more quickly to help reduce consistent errors between the target and the actual value. I term should be increased gradually in steps of 10 to 20% until you see evidence of I term oscillation in your logs, and then you need to back it down again. Each axis is going to need to be adjusted separately, and again, unless you have a perfectly symmetric quad, you may find there's a different maximum I term for the roll and pitch axes. Tuning the yaw axis is a little different from tuning pitch and roll because the yaw axis typically has significant physical damping in the system. It's a lot less responsive than pitch and roll as a result. And this means that we don't typically need a derivative term on the yaw axis for multicopters. We're only going to be working with proportional and integral terms, P and I terms. This means that we only need to consider the PI balance and overall gains when we're tuning the yaw axis. And the way to do this is again to increase the P and I gains together, stepping up in steps of 10%, keeping the ratio the same until you see oscillations, and then backing the gains down 10, 20% until you don't see oscillations anymore, but the gains are as high as they can be. And then once you've done that with both the P and I gain together, you can then, if you want to, attempt to increase the I term individually up a little bit more, again, looking for any oscillations in the logs. You may find that you also want to reduce the yaw error filtering on the axes in order to improve the responsiveness of the yaw axis. Now we need to talk about derivative feed-forward, and derivative feed-forward is a really useful tool in the rate controller. Derivative feed-forward acts as soon as the target begins to change, and it pushes the drone in the direction of that change of target, in effect getting the drone moving before PID error builds up and reducing, or even in some cases eliminating, delay between the actual response of the drone and the target rate of rotation. DFF should not be added until you have got the PD balance tuned on both pitch and roll axes, because PD balance cannot easily be tuned with any derivative feed forward enabled. So if for any reason you're going back and tuning PD balance, make sure to first disable derivative feed forward by setting ATC rate pitch DFF and ATC rate roll DFF to 0 in Mission Planner config tab full parameter list. When you're starting to enable derivative feed forward, start with a value of 0.001 for both pitch and roll as a starting point, and then it's likely you may need to increase them further from there. Derivative feed forward is not visible at all in the RGPilot PID review tool in the web tools. In order to tune derivative feed forward, you're going to have to go into Mission Planner, Data Flash Logs, and the Reviewer Log menu. That will open the log browser, which we've been using before, and you're going to find the relevant graphs under PID-P for pitch and PID-R for roll. Once you open these submenus, you're going to find some radio buttons, and you can turn on Target, Actual, P and DFF, which is what I'm using. This will show you how DFF is acting and how it's affecting the target and the actual values. What you're looking for is to try and reduce the delay between the peak of the actual and the peak of the target. So without any derivative feed forward, you're always going to find the peak of the actual happens after the peak of the target. When you add derivative feed forward, the thing you'll notice is that the delay between the actual peak and the target peak will start reducing. And if you keep adding derivative feed forward, and you keep going, you will, in some cases, actually be able to move the actual peak ahead of the target. That's not desirable. And you'll also see that too much derivative feed forward will cause overshoots, like I've got in this log here, where there's so much derivative feed forward that the actual value is actually getting ahead of the target. You can see green here is ahead of red, and you get a big overshoot. That's not desirable. Here's a log where derivative feed forward is correctly tuned. Here we still actually do have a small amount of delay between actual and target, but overshoot is minimized and we have a lot less delay now that derivative feed forward has been enabled than we had before we had enabled any derivative feed forward. That reduction in delay really benefits the control loops further up the chain, as it allows them to hold better angle, better velocity, and overall better navigation, position navigation, than you would be able to get if you did not have any DFF. So this is quite an advanced topic. It's worth just having a play with DFF and doing some test flights, seeing how it behaves in the log. And again, just trying to find that nice balance where you're not getting too much overshoot, but you are making some improvement in the delay between the actual trace and the target trace. Now let's talk about derivative feed forward on yaw. The yaw axis is typically a pretty slow axis to respond, and derivative feed forward can help reduce the delay on yaw. However, in many cases, a very rapid yaw response is not necessary. The speed with which the craft needs to change heading is always much slower than the speed with which it needs to change pitch and roll angle. However, you may decide you want to try and use derivative feed forward on yaw to reduce the delay. If you do, this is going to come down to the particular drone that you're tuning and the application that you're targeting. If you use derivative feed forward, the tuning approach is exactly the same as what I've described for using on pitch and roll. You're going to be using the ATC rate yaw DFF term, which you can find in Mission Planner full parameter list, to adjust the derivative feed forward on yaw. You may also need to introduce target filtering on yaw if you don't already have target filtering enabled, again to control noise on the derivative feed forward signal. Again, target a signal to noise ratio of 10 or better. And overall, that should be the same process as you've used on pitch and roll to get the yaw axis tuned up with derivative feed forward. Whenever you're using derivative feed forward, you also need to consider the target filtering. Whenever you take a derivative, high frequency noise gets amplified, and in the case of derivative feed forward, we're taking the derivative of the target, and therefore we're going to be amplifying all the high frequency noise in the target. It's important to check derivative feed forward for noise in the same way that you check the D term, and to do exactly the same process that we did for derivative filtering earlier on with the target to make sure that the signal to noise ratio, that is the amount of high frequency noise on top of the derivative feed forward signal, is no more than about 10% of the size of the overall derivative feed forward signal. So here we have an acceptably noisy derivative feed forward trace. You can see that we do have some amplification of high frequency noise, but that in general the high frequency noise is only about 10% or so of the amplitude of the derivative feed forward signal. You can adjust the target filtering on pitch and roll in Mission Planner config tab full parameter list, and it's ATC rate roll FLTT and ATC rate pitch FLTT. If you're using derivative feed forward, you are going to need some level of target filtering. So if before now you've disabled target filtering in an attempt to get the drone to respond more quickly, if you're adding in derivative feed forward to try and further reduce the delay, you may need to add back in target filtering. You almost certainly will need to add back in target filtering. And just as a reminder, the correct initial value to start with for target filtering is half the gyro low pass filter cutoff. So if you have a gyro low pass filter cutoff of 80 Hertz, then start with a target filtering cutoff of 40 Hertz. And of course, you can tune it along with derivative feed forward to make sure that you have the minimum delay from the filter. So you're raising the cutoff as high as possible. And you're also checking that signal to noise ratio to make sure that it's not going too much below 10. Now that the P, I, and D terms have been correctly tuned, we can start to look at the feed forward terms, starting with the feed forward term in the pitch and roll rate controller. In general, feed forward is not typically required in the pitch and roll rate controllers. Once the drone starts to rotate in a particular direction, conservation of momentum takes over, and the drag slowing the rotation of the drone is very, very small compared to the thrust from the props. This means that the feed forward effect isn't really desirable. You don't need additional motor differential to maintain a higher roll rate. The motor differential really is just there to get the quad going with the rotation, to accelerate it into the rotation, and then the rotation rate's preserved just by conservation of angular momentum. It's therefore usually correct to keep the rate pitch feed forward and rate roll feed forward at 0, and you can find these parameters in the full parameter list. They're 0 by default, and in most cases you'll want to keep them as 0. Feed forward in the yaw rate controller is slightly different. Feed forward can be useful in this case because to maintain a target rotation rate on yaw, you have to have a constant motor differential, because there needs to be effectively an exchange of angular momentum between the drone and the air constantly in order to keep the drone rotating. It can therefore be useful to add a small positive amount of rate yaw feed forward. Again, you can find ATC rate yaw FF in Mission Planner config tab full parameter list. And you want to add ATC rate yaw feed forward until the actual peak, so the amplitude of the actual peak in the time domain, matches up with the amplitude of the target peak. Often with your axis, you won't necessarily be able to achieve this just with P term alone. So a bit of feed forward can really help get those to the same level. And once they're at the same level, that's going to give you the most accurate response for the yaw rate controller.